My name is Reese Callahan, I am 34 years old, and the night my mother decided I no longer deserved a place in the life we had built together still sits in my chest like a bruise that never fully fades. I keep thinking about how quiet the moment actually was. No raised voices at first. No dramatic confrontation. Just the soft click of a deadbolt that was never supposed to lock against me, and the sudden understanding that the woman who once held my hand through every childhood fever had chosen someone else over me without a single warning. If you have ever trusted a family friend with the keys to your world only to watch that trust get used as a weapon, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you know what it feels like when the people who should protect you start treating your independence like a personal insult. I lived in a quiet high-end gated neighborhood on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada, the kind of place where the desert hills rise up behind the stucco walls and everyone pretends the outside world cannot reach them. I had worked for years as a freelance digital interface designer, building quiet little software tools that hospitals and small clinics used to manage patient records. The work kept me mostly at home, which my mother had always treated like a personal failure. She preferred the kind of daughter who clocked into a glass office tower and brought home a title she could brag about at her weekly coffee circle. My half-brother Travis lived 3 streets over in the same community. We shared the same father, who had left when I was 9 and Travis was only 4. After that, my mother raised us with the help of her closest friend, Betty Jo Hargrove. Betty Jo and her husband Earl had been fixtures in our lives for as long as I could remember. She was the woman who showed up with casseroles after my father disappeared, the woman who drove me to late-night design deadlines when my own car broke down, the woman I once called my second mother without a single ounce of irony. That trust is exactly what she used against me. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I had spent the morning at the public library downtown finishing a client presentation because the quiet rooms there helped me focus better than my own kitchen table. Ivy Soto, the librarian who always saved the corner study corral for me, had just brought over a fresh stack of reference books when my phone buzzed with a message from the neighborhood gate system. The notification said my access code had been temporarily suspended pending a family security update. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds, certain it was a glitch. I called my mother first. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and almost casual. "Reese, honey, don't panic. We just needed to make a small adjustment for safety reasons. Travis noticed some unusual activity on the shared accounts and Betty Jo and I decided it was better to lock things down until we could talk." I asked her what unusual activity she meant. She only sighed the way she always did when she thought I was being difficult. "We'll discuss it when you get here. Just come to the house. Betty Jo is already waiting with the paperwork." I drove the 20 minutes back to the gated community with my hands locked around the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I reached the entrance, the guard looked almost apologetic as he told me my code no longer worked. He had to call up to my mother's house for clearance. The intercom crackled, my mother's voice floated out, and the heavy iron gate finally rolled open. I parked in the circular driveway of the house I had helped pay the property taxes on for the last 6 years. The front door was already open. Betty Jo stood just inside the foyer holding a thick manila folder against her chest like a shield. My mother stood beside her, arms crossed, the expression on her face the same one she used when I was 16 and stayed out past curfew. "Come in and sit down," my mother said. "We need to talk about your future in this family." I stepped over the threshold. The air inside smelled like the lavender cleaner Betty Jo always used. Nothing looked different, yet everything felt rearranged. Travis was not there. Earl hovered near the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Betty Jo spoke. First, her tone soft and almost motherly. "Reese, we love you. That has never changed. But the way you have been handling money and decisions lately has started to worry all of us. Your mother asked me to look over the joint accounts we set up years ago for the property and the emergency fund. What I found was concerning." She opened the folder and slid a single printed sheet across the coffee table. It was a phone log, rows of numbers and timestamps highlighted in yellow. Most of the calls were between my number and a local number I did not recognize. A few were late at night. These calls, Betty Jo continued, line up with withdrawals from the shared emergency account. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Travis already confirmed he never authorized them. Your mother is terrified you are in some kind of trouble you won't talk about. I felt the floor tilt under my feet. I had never touched that emergency account. The only person who still had the secondary login was Betty Jo herself. I had given it to her 3 years earlier when I was recovering from a long bout of pneumonia and needed someone I trusted to handle bill payments if I ended up in the hospital again. I looked at my mother. You know I didn't take that money. She did not answer right away. She only reached over and rested her hand on Betty Jo's arm, the same way she used to rest it on mine when I was small and scared. I know you are under a lot of pressure with your freelance work, my mother said quietly. But pressure makes people do things they later regret. Betty Jo and I have already spoken with the bank. We are freezing the shared accounts until we can get a clearer picture. Travis agrees it is the safest step. For now, it is better if you stay somewhere else while we sort this out. The guest room at Betty Jo and Earl's house is ready if you need it. The words landed with a strange, almost gentle finality. My mother was not yelling. She was not even raising her voice. She was simply removing me from the house I had helped maintain, using the trusted family friend as both witness and enforcer, and framing the entire thing as protection. I asked to see the full bank statements. Betty Jo closed the folder. That will only upset you further right now. We will sit down with a neutral third party once everyone has had a chance to calm down. Earl finally spoke, his voice low. Just give them a few days, Reese. No one is trying to hurt you. I left the house with nothing but my laptop bag and the clothes I was wearing. The gate code still did not work when I tried to leave. I had to wait for the guard to open it manually. As I drove away I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Betty Jo standing on the porch with her arm around my mother's shoulders, the two of them watching me go like I was the one who had done something unforgivable. That night I checked into a cheap extended stay motel on the edge of the city because every joint account was frozen and my personal checking balance sat at a few $100s after the month's client payments had not yet cleared. I sat on the edge of the bed with the phone log still open on my laptop screen, trying to understand how the numbers could exist when I had never made those calls. Around midnight my phone lit up with a text from Travis. Mom and Betty Jo told me everything. I don't know what you're mixed up in, but you need to fix this. The family is already dealing with enough. I typed 3 different replies and deleted every one of them. In the end I only sent back a single question. Did you look at the actual account records yourself? He never answered. The next morning I drove to the branch of the bank where the shared accounts were held. The teller recognized me and looked uncomfortable when I asked for printed statements. She disappeared into the back for almost 20 minutes. When she returned she was accompanied by a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as Cameron Frost, an insurance and fraud adjuster the bank had already contacted at my mother's request. Cameron placed a second set of documents on the counter. These were not phone logs. They were copies of recent insurance claim forms filed against a small life and disability policy my mother and I had co-owned for years. The claims listed me as the incapacitated party and named Norma Callahan as the authorized decision-maker under a power of attorney I had no memory of signing. I stared at the signature line. The handwriting looked enough like mine that a casual glance would never question it. Cameron's voice stayed carefully neutral. Your mother and Ms. Hargrove submitted these documents 3 days ago. They stated you had become unable to manage your affairs and that temporary control was necessary for your protection. The bank is required to investigate before releasing further funds. Until the review is complete, all joint assets remain frozen. I asked him who had submitted the power of attorney. He checked his notes. Betty Jo Hargrove, acting as witness and notary. The same woman who had once driven me to emergency rooms and sat with me through sleepless nights had notarized a document that handed my financial life to my mother without my knowledge. I walked out of the bank into the bright Reno sunlight feeling like the ground itself had been pulled out from under me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a group message from my mother that included Travis, Betty Jo, and Earl. "We are scheduling a family meeting for Friday evening at Betty Jo's house. Attendance is not optional if you want any chance of resolving this quietly. Bring whatever explanation you have. We are prepared to listen." I sat in my car in the bank parking lot and read the message 3 times. The language was polite. The invitation even sounded almost loving. Yet every word made it clear that the decision had already been made. I was the problem that needed solving, and the people who claimed to love me had already chosen sides. I drove back to the motel, locked the door, and opened my laptop again. Somewhere in the encrypted cloud folder I had kept for years was every tax return, every old bank statement, and every digital signature certificate I had ever used for client work. If someone had forged a power of attorney using my name, the metadata would not match. I just needed time and a quiet place to prove it. Outside the thin motel window, the desert wind had started to pick up, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and distant rain. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and tried to steady my breathing. My mother had not screamed at me. Betty Jo had not called me names. They had simply rewritten the story of who I was and handed that new version to everyone else, and the people I once trusted most had accepted it without question. I still did not know how far they were willing to go. I spent most of that first night in the motel scrolling through years of archived files, the blue light of the laptop the only thing keeping the room from feeling completely empty. Every digital signature certificate I had ever used for client contracts sat in one encrypted folder, each one timestamped and hashed in a way that made forgery almost impossible to hide if someone knew where to look. The power of attorney my mother and Betty Jo had filed carried a signature that looked close enough to mine at a glance, yet the metadata underneath told a different story. The document had been created on a machine I had never owned, at a time when my own laptop was logged into a client server halfway across the country. I saved everything to a separate drive and tried to sleep. Sleep never came. By morning my eyes burned and the thin motel walls seemed to press closer than they had the night before. I drove back to the public library as soon as it opened, needing the familiar quiet and the one person who had never asked me to explain myself. Ivy Soto was already at the reference desk. She took one look at my face and simply nodded toward the private study room in the back, the one she usually reserved for graduate students. She brought coffee a few minutes later and sat across from me without asking questions until I was ready to speak. When I finally told her what had happened, her expression stayed calm, but her hands tightened around her own cup. She offered to let me use the library's secure scanner and a private computer that was not connected to any of my usual accounts. I spent the next 3 hours digitizing every printed statement I still had and cross-checking the phone log Betty Jo had shown me. The numbers on that log did not match any of my carrier records. Several of the late-night calls had originated from a prepaid phone purchased in cash at a convenience store 3 miles from Betty Jo and Earl's house. The store's security camera still had footage from that week. I did not yet know how to get it, but the knowledge that the evidence existed settled something cold and steady inside my chest. Cameron Frost called me that afternoon. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had seen too many family disputes turn ugly. He asked me to come back to the bank. When I arrived, he led me into a small conference room and closed the door. "I ran a deeper check on the power of attorney," he said. "The notary stamp belongs to Betty Jo Hargrove, which we already knew. What we did not know is that the same stamp was used on 2 other documents filed the same day. One is a temporary change of beneficiary on the life policy. The other is a request to transfer the remaining balance of the shared emergency account into a new account held solely in your mother's name. Both requests are currently under review, but the paperwork is complete enough that they could be approved by the end of the week if no one challenges them." I asked him what would stop the transfer. He slid a form across the table. "A formal written dispute from you, supported by any evidence you have that the power of attorney was not voluntarily signed. Once that is filed, everything freezes for a mandatory investigation period. I can help you start the process today, But you should know that your mother and Ms. Hargrove have already retained counsel. They are framing this as protective action for a family member in crisis. The longer you wait, the stronger their narrative becomes. I signed the dispute form with a hand that felt strangely steady. Cameron promised to file it before close of business. As I left the bank, I noticed a familiar truck parked across the street. Earl Hargrove sat behind the wheel, watching the entrance. He did not try to hide. When our eyes met, he simply started the engine and drove away. That evening, my half-brother finally answered my earlier text with a phone call. His voice sounded tired and edged with the same frustration he had carried since we were teenagers. "Mom says you are spreading stories about Betty Jo forging documents," he said without greeting. "She is devastated. Betty Jo has been nothing but good to this family. Why are you doing this?" I told him about the metadata, the prepaid phone, the convenience store camera. He interrupted before I could finish. "I do not care about technical details. I care that you are tearing this family apart over money you were never supposed to touch in the first place. Mom and Betty Jo are trying to protect what is left. If you keep pushing, you are going to force everyone to choose sides, and you are not going to like the side I end up on." The line went quiet for a moment. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "There are things about the emergency fund you do not understand. Leave it alone, Reese. For once in your life, just leave something alone." He hung up before I could ask what he meant. I sat on the edge of the motel bed replaying those last words. Things about the emergency fund I did not understand. My half-brother had always been private about money. He worked in logistics for a regional shipping company and lived quietly, yet somehow he managed to take expensive fishing trips twice a year and had recently paid cash for a new truck. I had never questioned it. Now the phrase private slush fund floated through my mind like something half-remembered from a conversation I was never meant to overhear. The next morning I received an email from one of my longest-standing clients, a small clinic network that had used my interface software for almost 4 years. The message was polite and final. They had decided to pause our current project and explore other vendors. The decision, they wrote, came after a conversation with a concerned family friend who had reached out on my behalf to express worries about my current capacity to deliver. The email was signed by the clinic's operations director, but the language felt familiar. Betty Jo had always been skilled at sounding helpful while planting quiet doubts. I drove to Betty Jo and Earl's house that afternoon without calling first. The gated community's temporary visitor code still worked for their address. Earl answered the door and tried to block the entrance with his body. Behind him I could see my mother seated at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a cup of coffee, as if this were any ordinary afternoon visit. Betty Jo appeared from the hallway, her expression already arranged into gentle disappointment. "Reese, we asked you to wait until Friday. Showing up like this only makes things harder." I held up the printed email from the clinic. "You called my client. You told them I was not capable of finishing the work." She did not deny it. She only sighed and glanced at my mother for support. "I was trying to protect your reputation. If you collapse under the pressure of everything that is happening, your professional relationships will suffer worse than a temporary pause." I did what any friend would do. My mother's voice cut in, quiet and firm. "You have always been too proud to accept help, Reese. That pride is exactly why we are in this situation. Betty Jo and I have already spoken with 2 other clients who were growing concerned. We are not trying to destroy your career. We are trying to keep you from destroying it yourself. If you will simply sign the temporary guardianship papers we have prepared, everything can go back to normal. You can stay here with us until the investigation clears. We will handle the bank and the insurance. All you have to do is stop fighting." She slid a new set of documents across the table. The top page carried the same notary stamp I had already seen. The language inside granted my mother full authority over every financial and medical decision for a period of 1 year, renewable at her discretion. I did not touch the papers. I looked at Betty Jo instead. "You notarized a power of attorney I never signed. You used the login I trusted you with to move money and create a paper trail that makes me look guilty. And now you are calling the people who pay my bills and telling them I am falling apart. Tell me again how this is protection." Betty Jo's eyes filled with the same soft tears she had used when I was a child and needed comfort. She reached for my hand. I stepped back. Earl cleared his throat. "Maybe. Everyone needs to cool off before Friday. No decisions have to be made today." My mother stood. The warmth she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something colder and more absolute. "Friday is not a discussion, Reese. It is a deadline. If you do not appear and sign the guardianship papers, we will have no choice but to petition the court for emergency protective orders based on the evidence we already have. The phone log, the insurance claims, the concerns from your clients. A judge will see a pattern. You can either accept help from the people who love you, or you can watch strangers decide what happens to the rest of your life. Those are the only two options left." I left the house without another word. The desert air outside felt sharper than it had that morning. In the car I sat with both hands on the wheel and forced myself to breathe until the shaking in my arms slowed. Then I drove back to the library, where Ivy was waiting with the study room already reserved and a fresh notebook open on the table. "Whatever you need," she said simply. "I am here." I spent the rest of the afternoon reconstructing the timeline of every document, every phone call, every transfer. Late that night, while the library lights dimmed around me, I found the connection I had been missing. Buried in an old shared folder that Travis had once used for family tax documents was a series of transfers from the emergency account into a separate offshore-linked savings vehicle. The account was registered under a limited liability company whose only listed manager was my half-brother. The amounts were not enormous, but they had been moving steadily for almost 2 years, always just below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting. Betty Jo's login had been used for every single transfer. My half-brother's private fund had been built with money taken from the account I was now being accused of draining. My mother and Betty Jo had known. They had helped hide it. And when the risk of discovery became too great, they had simply rewritten the story so that I became the thief. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkening study room with the knowledge settling over me like dust. The family meeting was in less than 48 hours. They expected me to arrive broken and ready to sign. Instead, I now held the one piece of evidence that could turn every accusation they had made back onto them. I just did not yet know whether the truth would be enough to save what little of my life still belonged to me. I did not sleep the night before the family meeting. The discovery of my half-brother's private funds sat in my mind like a stone I could not set down. Every transfer had been small enough to avoid attention, yet together they formed a clear pattern of money leaving the shared emergency account and landing in an entity only he controlled. Betty Jo's login had authorized each one. My mother had signed the tax documents that kept the arrangement invisible. They had built their quiet little structure on the same account they were now using to paint me as unstable and dishonest. Friday evening arrived with the kind of dry desert wind that always made the gated community feel more isolated than it really was. I drove through the visitor gate using the temporary code Ivy had helped me request under a different name, parked 2 houses down from Betty Jo and Earl's place, and walked the rest of the way. I carried only a slim folder containing the metadata reports, the convenience store purchase record for the prepaid phone, the transfer logs from the limited liability company, and the formal dispute Cameron Frost had already filed with the bank. Earl opened the door before I could knock. His face looked older than it had 3 days earlier. He stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the living room had been arranged like a small tribunal. My mother sat in the center of the couch. Betty Jo occupied the armchair to her right. My half-brother stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. A woman I did not recognize sat at the dining table with a legal pad and a pen. She introduced herself as Denise Holloway, the attorney my mother and Betty Jo had retained. My mother spoke first, her voice soft and measured. "We are glad you came, Reese. We want this resolved quietly. Denise is here only to make sure the paperwork is handled correctly. If we can reach an agreement tonight, I placed my folder on the coffee table and opened it to the first page. I am not here to sign anything. I am here to show you what the bank already has. I slid the transfer logs toward the center of the table. My half-brother's shoulders stiffened the moment he recognized the account numbers. Betty Jo's hand moved as if she wanted to cover the pages, then stopped. My mother's expression did not change, but the muscles along her jaw tightened. "Those transfers were authorized," she said. "Travis needed help with a business opportunity. The money was always going to be returned." I turned to the next set of documents, the one showing Betty Jo's login used for every movement of funds. "Then why did you create a phone log that made it look like I was the one draining the account? Why file a power of attorney I never signed? Why call my clients and tell them I was falling apart?" Betty Jo's eyes filled again, the same practiced tears I had seen all my life. "We were protecting the family. You have always been unpredictable with money and decisions. Someone had to step in before everything collapsed." Denise Holloway cleared her throat and began gathering the papers. "These documents will need to be reviewed properly. Perhaps we should adjourn until..." The doorbell rang. Earl opened it to find Cameron Frost standing on the porch with 2 additional bank investigators and a representative from the state insurance division. Cameron's voice stayed professional and quiet. "Ms. Callahan, Ms. Hargrove, we received the formal dispute 3 days ago. The preliminary review of the power of attorney and the recent beneficiary changes has raised enough red flags that we are placing an immediate freeze on every account connected to these documents. We will also need statements from everyone present tonight. The insurance division has opened its own inquiry into the disability claims filed last week." My mother's face went pale. Betty Jo sank deeper into the armchair. My half-brother finally looked up, and for the first time I saw something close to fear in his eyes. The next 2 hours unfolded in careful, recorded statements. I answered every question with the evidence I had brought. Cameron and the investigators took copies of everything. When they left, the living room felt smaller and colder than before. Denise Holloway packed her legal pad without another word and followed them out. Earl retreated to the kitchen. Only my mother, Betty Jo, and my half-brother remained. My mother stood slowly. "You have destroyed this family," she said, the softness gone from her voice. "Everything we did was to keep the peace and protect what little we had left. You chose to burn it instead." I looked at my half-brother. "You let them use me as the cover for your private fund. You let them call me a thief so no one would look at the real transfers. How long did you think that would hold?" He did not answer. He only turned and walked out the front door. The sound of his truck starting and driving away was the last thing any of us heard from him that night. I left a few minutes later. No one tried to stop me. The bank investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 10 days the power of attorney was declared invalid. The beneficiary changes were reversed. The limited liability company account was frozen pending further review, and a portion of the transferred funds was eventually returned to the original emergency account under court supervision. Betty Jo's notary commission came under formal review. My mother received a letter from the insurance division requiring her to repay the temporary benefits she had already drawn. None of them faced criminal charges. The system preferred quiet restitution over public spectacle. The family fortune, such as it was, simply redirected itself away from the people who had tried to control it. What could not be redirected was the silence that followed. My half-brother never contacted me again. My mother sent one final message through Earl stating that she needed time and space. Betty Jo and Earl sold their house in the gated community 6 months later and moved to a smaller place across the state line. I never learned whether they stayed in touch with my mother. I only knew that the weekly coffee circle my mother had once ruled no longer included my name in any conversation. I moved out of the extended stay motel and into a modest apartment on the other side of Reno, far from the gated walls and the desert hills that had once felt like home. Ivy helped me carry boxes up the stairs on a Saturday morning when the wind was sharp and clean. She stayed for coffee and did not fill the quiet with advice. Cameron Frost sent a final email confirming that all joint accounts had been permanently separated and that my personal credit had been restored. One of the clinics that had paused my contract eventually returned, though 2 others never did. The professional damage was real and lasting. There were nights when the loss still rose up without warning. I would be standing at the kitchen sink rinsing a single plate and suddenly feel the weight of every gentle word my mother had used while she locked me out of my own life. The tears would come hard and quiet, the kind that leave your chest aching for hours afterward. I did not try to stop them. I simply let them finish, then wiped my face and continued with whatever small task had been interrupted. I learned that freedom can arrive wrapped in grief. I no longer had to explain my choices to people who had already decided I was the problem. I no longer had to protect a version of family that only existed when I stayed small and grateful. The cost of that clarity was everything I had once called home. Chosen family does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it is a librarian who saves you a quiet room and never asks for the full story. Sometimes it is a bank investigator who treats your evidence with the same seriousness he would give a stranger. Those connections do not erase the ache of what was lost. They simply make it possible to keep living afterward. I still drive past the old gated community once or twice a year when the road takes me that way. The houses look the same. The hills behind them have not moved. I do not stop. I keep driving, the desert light steady on the windshield, and I let the past stay where it belongs. Thank you for listening to my story. How far is too far when the people who raised you decide your independence is the real threat? I would genuinely like to know what you would have done in my place.